Grab your gear, everybody, and let's dive into the after show.
Yeah, so we're naming this the Aquaman Deep Dive because everything is water puns in this episode.
Yes.
And I have dug very deep into Aquaman's history to find out a bunch of stuff. So a lot of it is from before I was born. So bear with me here. But the original Aquaman from the golden age of comics actually debuted in More Fun Comics number 73, which you mentioned earlier, in, what was it, 1941? The interesting thing is this is also the first appearance of Green Arrow. So More Fun Comics was an anthology book featuring multiple characters and stories per issue. And this one also had stories featuring Dr. Fate, the Spectre, and Johnny Quick, who is a speedster.
Nice.
Aquaman was created by Mort Weisinger and Paul Norris and was originally envisioned as the result of his father, Mr. Waterman's scientific experimentation. This version of Aquaman was recently revealed to have a civilian identity of Adam Waterman. And while his parents were interested in studying Atlantis, Aquaman himself was not from there. During the 1940s, he fought Nazi submariners and the pirate Blackjack, and only ever interacted with other DC characters, the All-Star Squadron. And this continuity was actually designated as Earth 2 and was erased completely by Crisis on Infinite Earths in the 80s.
Wow.
But up until last month, there was a debate as to whether or not this version of Aquaman ever really existed in canon on Earth 2, because he never crossed over with other DC characters, while most of the other guys did. I think there was like an elderly Superman that was part of the JSA and was from Earth 2, and a lot of those characters, they just kind of wiped the slate clean once Crisis on Infinite Earths happened. But
yeah. I think if I had a character, I had a character who is aquatic based, who is named Waterman, whose superhero name was Aquaman, like I'd probably want to, correct a few things there myself. So
yeah,
I think that kind of would make sense that you would want to sort of, block that off a little bit.
Yeah, so it's interesting because it's different than like the Jay Garrick original Flash or Alan Scott original Green Lantern. Those are characters that still have a following and still kind of exist. But Adam Waterman is not something that fans were ever clamoring to go back to. So although Jeff Johns did recently reveal in the new Golden Age #1, published last year, that Adam Waterman was a founding member of the Justice Society. So that's like a retcon that they just came up with like 3 months ago. So yeah. And that, of course, ended the debate about did he or did he not exist in continuity back then.
I guess they poured him back into the continuity.
Yeah. Well, one of the fun things actually about that issue is they did sort of like who's who profile pages that are in the style of like Golden Age art, showing like a backstory of the characters. And there's a lot of retcons that were done there, but it's made to look like a comic from that era. So that was kind of like a neat thing that they did. And we've talked about Jeff Johns before because he wrote the Black Rain crossover that we did with the JSA and Hawkman. So yeah, I think he just really likes the Golden Age of comics. I think that's something he's a big fan of.
That's a really neat thing that DC does, is to have those legacy superheroes and that sort of thing. And again, it's like I say this all the time, DC just need to differentiate yourselves from Marvel. Like, don't, in the MCU, don't try to be like, because those movies are successful, be like them. Do your own thing. There are plenty of DC characters that can stand on their own that we'd really like to see in movies, and they don't need to replicate the MCU. That's Marvel. That's great. Marvel is great. It's its own thing. DC is great. Let it be its own thing. And I just, let that.
Yeah, I really hope. You had to get one more pun in. I really hope that the direction we're going with James Gunn is going to be kind of like that. Although he is talking about making animation, video games, movies, and TV all interconnected, which to me is maybe ambitious? Unnecessary. I don't know. Yeah, that's but what I do like about that is he says the same actor is going to be playing the same character in everything. So that does seem like kind of a good thing where it's like
Yeah,
whoever we pick for this role, you're that person like every time.
as
So
long as
whether it's
they're versatile,
animation, exactly.
because there's a
Yeah,
lot
because
of,
they're
yeah, like actors who
that's
are
what you were
great
going to say,
actors,
yeah.
but as far as voice actors, they're like very stiff. So I think it would be
Mhm.
hard to find, a lot of people that could, you know, be that flexible that they could work in any medium like that.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's going to be more challenging than maybe they realize. I don't, or maybe they have a plan. I
Or
don't
maybe
know.
they'll give them some coaching and, teach them not to be so stiff. That would
Yeah,
be great.
yeah, hopefully. Anyway, with so the version of Aquaman that we know is of course Arthur Curry, and that
Hmm.
came about in the Silver Age in the 1960s, written by Robert Bernstein and penciled by Ramona Fradon, and they created the characters of Tom Curry and Atlanta in Adventure Comics number 260, which I have here. I don't know how well you can see that, but I believe at the bottom there somewhere it says the origin of Aquaman or how he got his powers. So,
Okay.
um, that this is the single most expensive comic book that I own. So I'm not going to open it because this is one
Makes
of
sense.
those where I had to buy it on layaway and put it in a bag and never take it out again. And if I want to read that, then I'll do it digitally somewhere.
Hmm.
But it's significant because that's the first time that his parents ever appeared. And actually, the scene from the Aquaman movie where he puts his hand up to the glass and all the fish are coming at him, that's in that comic book as well.
Okay.
So it's very like influential in basically everything that has come after. So
Yeah.
that established that Tom Curry is the lighthouse keeper and Atlanta is the Atlantean queen. And during the Silver Age, Arthur Curry was seen as like an outcast from Atlantis, and he had lots of adventures with Aqualad, later named Garth, who was his ward. So again, they were kind of going for like the Batman and Robin type tone. This was very much a time when every hero had to have that. So like Green Arrow had Speedy, who's Roy Harper, and Aquaman had Aqualad, who's Garth. But one cool thing about DC is that they have aged up these characters throughout the years. So, Speedy eventually became Arsenal, and
Hmm.
Dick Grayson, Robin eventually became Nightwing, and so with Garth, he became Tempest. That's his adult superhero
Okay.
identity, and he's very different than just kind of like the oh shucks Aquaman, what are we gonna do now? That kind of a character, which for the 60s was very appropriate. But
Yeah.
so another weird thing about this era is that it was also established that as a child, Arthur had adventures as Aqua Boy and interacted with Superboy or an adolescent Clark Kent. So yeah, there was actually Superman was so popular at this time that he had like multiple comic books, and one of them was Superboy about his adolescent adventures,
Wow.
basically. So yeah, I think Lois Lane had her own book. I mean, Jimmy Olsen had his own book. I mean, it was like Superman was a big seller back then. So
Yeah.
this also was a time when we saw a lot more superhero team ups. I think you mentioned that he was a founding member of the Justice League, which he was, but he also had kind of like one-off team ups with Superman and Green Arrow and lots of other characters. So
I think
yeah.
that's one of those things that, since these comic books have been around for, so long and have
Mm-hmm.
gone through not just, multiple eras and multiple ages of, time periods, but also like iterations and, every new writer
Mm-hmm.
wants to do something with them. So we get all this variation in their history. And a lot of it's, what was trending at the time. But yeah, like you mentioned, like
Right.
wards or sidekicks and then team ups. And then now we're going to make
Mm-hmm.
the children's version, and then there might be like an anime where there's the like little chibi kids where it's like they're in multicolored diapers that like Superman's got a red, white, and blue diaper, and like they take these characters who are very successful and they try to morph them into other versions that can appeal
Mm-hmm.
to wider audiences. Like now we have a children's show, now we have Titans, which is an adult edgier show, and then we have the stuff for
Right.
kids, and taking them and trying to branch them out like that. So it's just funny that you mentioned that, like, yeah, a lot of these characters went through those iterations where there's the
Mm-hmm.
cheesy version, there's the kid version, there's the, you know, more grittier version. And I liked the version that they
Yeah.
had in the movie. Like I felt like he, you know, he was
Mm-hmm.
very different than the sort of like blonde Aquaman that we get in the comics. And,
Yeah.
you know, as far as like an actor standpoint, like that was fine. But, you know,
Mm-hmm.
as far as being like traditional Aquaman, I guess they were trying to differentiate from, you know, the guy from Super
Mm-hmm.
Friends, who we won't talk about because he was too cheesy.
Yeah.
But it I'm glad that they went this direction. I guess that's what I'm trying to get to, is I'm glad they went
Mm-hmm.
this direction to, you know, make him a little more accessible and give him, you know, something to stand on his own. Because that was one thing I was saying about the comic during the episode was, you know, as far as his power set goes, you know, if he's just Superman underwater, then, you know, is he, what makes him Superman? Like Superman is Superman because he
Right.
comes from a different
Right.
planet. But if we
Mm-hmm.
take a group of Kryptonians and toss them on Earth, they're going to be just as powerful as Superman. So then
Right.
there's no difference between him and the rest of the Kryptonians because they all have the same power. So as
Right.
far as Aquaman goes, like what differentiates him between some other Atlantean? And it seemed like in the movie version, it was because of his telepathic ability and because of
Yeah.
being able, like having the heritage of being blood related to the king, and then he was able to take the trident, and the trident seemed to augment his power somehow, although they didn't really
Yeah.
explain it. So I guess that would be kind
Yeah.
of
Well,
my
and
questions.
the fact that he kind of has one foot in each world, I think
Yeah, that too.
introduces enough conflict into him as a character to set him apart, because then you have, you know, kind of, I mean, not exactly like Spock, but kind of that thing where it's like I'm of two worlds, like which one do I exist
Mhm.
in, which one do I feel at home in?
Or
A
like Ms.
lot of times
Marvel.
yeah, yeah, like a lot of times the Justice League is more like a family to him than like his own people, because
Hmm.
they're kind of like, you're a little bit too enamored with those people that live up there, and we don't really want anything to do with them. Like they're a problem. They dump toxic waste in our oceans, you know,
Yeah,
all that kind of stuff. So
they think he's fishy
I
but
think,
not in the right way.
yeah, they think he's fishy, but not in the right way. I think that was a really good idea for them to have, especially in the 60s when comics were really censored. And I mean, we had gone through this. I don't know if we've talked about the formation of like the Comics Code Authority, but right before the 60s, there was a paper published and sent to Congress called Seduction of the Innocent. And it was basically a long treatise on how comic books are corrupting the children of America and turning them into criminals. And the, you know, the Comics Code Authority was basically the industry establishing its own censorship standards to keep the bad PR away. And so horror comics started to go away. Batman started to get lighter and more like the Adam West show. You know, everybody had the teen sidekick. All of this kind of era came about because they were like, oh, we're not supposed to tell grown-up stories. So they kind of
Yeah.
had to swing the other direction. And then, you know, by the time we get to the 1980s, creators had been fed up with that for long enough that they started just pushing against it as hard as they could, until eventually we exist in a day now where like no one has that seal on the cover. You know,
Yeah.
they're not worried about it anymore. So I will say, this is obviously, Arthur Curry is obviously the version of Aquaman that caught on the most, because he never had his own title until 1962. So he had been in comics and
Mm.
like More Fun Comics and also in Adventure Comics as like backup stories for years, but he'd never had his own book until 62. And so that actually continued his adventures from the Adventure Comics stories. And that book ran for 63 total issues, although there were interruptions in his publication history between 71 and 77. But nearly every major villain in his rogues gallery was introduced during that era, including Black Manta, Ocean Master, the Scavenger, and the Fisherman, which are kind of like the big four. Black
The
Manta and Ocean
Fisherman.
Master are like, yeah, yeah,
I'm
he's
just
hard to describe.
imagining
he
I'm
fits.
imagining Aquaman like dangling from a hook. No, a fisherman got me.
Yeah,
The fisherman. Ah!
he's a guy that has kind of this like squid looking
Straw hat.
head
Oh,
dress, and I don't know, he has all these different lures. It's a very like 1960s kind of like,
what shall I
something
catch
like you would see
Aquaman
on the
with
Batman
today?
Adam West show. Yeah, yeah, he's a
Guy
character
with the
that
tackle
was
box.
relevant during this era, but we don't really see him past like the 70s a whole lot. So um but the scavenger is actually, I would assume, going to show up in the next movie, because he's kind of the other really big one that we haven't seen. And he's really somebody that just gets in a giant robot suit and goes underwater and pillages Atlantis's ruins and steals their riches, and usually kills people along the way while he's doing that.
Sure.
So he's never as much of a threat as Black Manta or Ocean Master, but he's somebody that's always kind of on the peripheral, like doing crappy stuff. So, I actually own his first appearance too. I should have brought it out. But that's another one of those comics that I don't open, because I have a feeling if he shows up in a movie at some point that it's going to become valuable all of a
Oh
sudden.
yeah.
So I sort of like bought it preemptively knowing that. So, and really anything from the Silver Age, if you own it, is worth money, because nobody took care of comics back then. So even though this copy of Adventure is like, I don't know, if the CDC were to grade it, or the CGC, sorry, it would probably be like a 4.5 or something. It's still worth a lot of money, just because there aren't a lot of them out there. So
Yeah, limited editions
I
and limited
also,
print are worth more
yeah,
for sure.
exactly. I mean, they weren't, the 90s is really when like mass production of comics started to become a thing, but
Yeah.
before then it's like it wasn't. So the other thing I wanted to mention about the Silver Age is that Ramona Fradon was one of the first female pencilers to become extremely successful within the industry, and she kind of like cut her teeth on the Aquaman title. So she did pencils for Adventure Comics. I don't know that she did a lot for his standalone once it moved over, but a lot of those characters that were introduced for the first time, it was her work basically that was instrumental in that. And also, I've got an art book. I don't know how well you can see that, but that there is like some of her pencils from back in the day in the 1960s. And then there's an inked picture of Aquaman with Plastic Man and Metamorpho.
Hmm.
Plastic Man and Metamorpho are actually created by her.
Oh wow.
So those are characters that didn't exist before she added them into comics. And she's very enamored with like animation from like the 50s and stuff like that. Like she was a big fan of kind of like people that did Bugs Bunny and some of those
Yeah.
animators like Tex Avery and stuff like that. So Metamorpho being able to change his body and like make a mallet and smack people and stuff like that, and also Plastic Man being a very cartoony character, that was kind of the stuff that she liked. So
Hmm.
it makes sense that she created them.
Sure.
So the I guess the other big historical event in comics that happened during this era was that Aquaman and Mera got married. So you said they were one of the first superheroes to get married. The reason we don't say they're the first is because I believe Jay Garrick was already married when he was introduced as a character. So he had a wife like Joan Garrick or something like that.
Yeah.
And but we didn't see the wedding on panel. So the first superhero wedding that we actually see is Aquaman and Mera. So that is kind of a big deal. I did not know this going into reading about this character first. I had always thought that it was Reed and Sue in the Fantastic
Yeah.
Four, because it's within like the first couple of years of their book, but they got beat out by like 1 or 2 years by Aquaman. So um
Well, and then Ant-Man
that,
and the Wasp, they got married around the same time, but it
yeah,
was after, wasn't
I
it?
I don't know. They might have been married when they were first introduced in Avengers already.
Hmm.
I think that was, I don't know. My Marvel history on them specifically is not excellent, so I wouldn't want to like say yes, this is how it was, but I feel like they were either married or engaged already when they were introduced. So, but I
Okay.
remember there being a lot of like conflict in that relationship in like the early, I don't know, it's been a long time since I've read my Essential Avengers, so yeah. On the topic of their relationship, unfortunately, their marital bliss didn't last as Black Manta murdered their child, Aqua Baby, or later known as Arthur Jr., in the Death of a Prince storyline by Steve Skeets and other pencilers. So this was in like the mid to late 70s, and this was absolutely shocking in comics at the time. And it kind of established like a clear change in the tone of his title. It was kind of like the loss of innocence of the Aquaman character. Like that, nothing was going to be the same after that. That's something they say in comics a lot now, but that really informed almost the next like 20 years of stories because it was such a monumental event in his title. So basically from this point on, Aquaman adopts a much angrier persona. And although Crisis on Infinite Earths was soon after that, this characterization for Arthur still remained, and his marriage with Mara dissolved in the wake of this event as well. So she kind of loses her mind and, you know, runs off in grief, and they're not together anymore. And so that's basically where the characters are at whenever we begin the post-crisis era, which would have been the 1980s.
That gives him a lot more motivation to hate Black Manta, because in the
Yes.
movie, he just seemed like he was just kind of annoying, like, get out of here.
Yeah.
And then he comes back
Mm-hmm.
with the suit and the Atlantean technology
Mm-hmm.
that apparently he was able to reverse engineer, even though they were advanced prototypes, but hey, whatever. And he comes back, and then he's like super annoying because he can actually hurt Aquaman, but then he still
Mm-hmm.
gets thwarted
Mm-hmm.
anyway. And then we see him drifting at the end of the movie, and it's like, does he, you know, if he comes back in the next movie or not, I don't really care. He felt like really shoehorned in the movie, that they could have
Yeah.
cut him and the movie would have been just fine as it was. Like, they really didn't make him seem like an important
Mm-hmm.
supervillain. Whereas what you just described is like, oh my gosh, he's
Yeah.
central to, you know, the Aquaman story. Like, this is
Yeah.
a personality changing, you know, life changing event for them,
Yeah.
that like, yeah, he would really hate Black Manta after that. I can get
Yeah.
that. Whereas in the
It's
movie, it's like he's just annoying.
and they had kind of built him up to be Arthur's archenemy before that point in comics, but I think it was kind of like what you described, where Black Manta would be, you know, killing or ripping off somebody on the ocean, and Aquaman would stop him. And they'd done this dance so many times that Black Manta hated Aquaman, but I don't know that Aquaman was like, "Oh, you're my worst enemy" or anything
Yeah.
like that. But after this event, it was very clear that like, yeah, this is the guy that we don't ever want to see again.
Yeah.
So, um, interestingly, after the Crisis on Infinite Earths event happened, there were two false restarts for the Aquaman title. There was one by Keith Giffen, and it's been collected in trade as like the Legend of Aquaman, that I think was a little bit too like the Silver Age stuff, and it wasn't very well received. And then there was another run of Aquaman that followed it right after by a different creative team that felt a little bit more early 90s, and he had like a blue suit with like waves on it and everything. It
Hmm.
was kind of a different take on the character, but most of that stuff was at least retained in continuity. But it wasn't until really Peter David took over writing duties in the early 90s that the character really started to take off again after Crisis on Infinite Earths. So they really had a hard time, unlike Batman and Superman and a lot of those other characters. They really had a hard time getting Aquaman's book going again and figuring out what the right angle was. So Peter David basically went back to ground zero and completely changed everything about his origin. So this continuity era is called New Earth, whereas like post New 52 is called Prime Earth. So this during the New Earth era, Aquaman was Prince Orin, not Arthur Curry, born to Queen Atlanta and the mysterious wizard Atlan in the city of Poseidonus. I'm not sure I'm saying that right, but the child was abandoned due to his blonde hair, which was seen as a curse in Atlantis, known as the Curse of Kordax. And Kordax is actually a character sort of like the Taint Bloods that we saw in the Dan Abnett story. Actually,
Hmm.
he's like scaly all over, and he has kind of a claim to the throne too. So he's a villain that will come back later. But the blonde hair was like his signature thing. So everybody saw that on the baby, and they're like, we don't want it. So he was actually left to die. And his only ally from an early age was Volko, a scientist who had no time for
Oh.
Atlantean superstition. So that's where we get that element of Volko kind of like raising him, or,
Mhm.
rescuing him or whatever, that you see in the movie. It really wasn't until Peter David's run that was really in there.
And you
Um,
mentioned Prince Orin. So that was one thing
yes.
in the story, that he
Hmm.
was calling himself Orin. And at first I was like, is he going by his brother's name? I'm like, no, that's Orm. So Orin
Yeah.
sounds very close to that. And I was a
Yeah.
little confused at first. And then I think I actually Googled that, because they don't really tell you in the story,
Hmm.
but that's his like Atlantean name. So then I was even
Yeah.
more confused, because I was like, well, he's in Atlantis hiding. He's known as Aquaman on the surface. So Aquaman's kind of like a good, cover name, although not if anybody
Yeah.
knows what's going on the surface. So instead, he's like,
Right.
well, I'm not going to go by Arthur Curry. I'm going to go by Orin. But if that's your Atlantean name, then wouldn't you just want to have a completely different name? Like, make something up.
Right.
Like, I'm
Yeah.
like Waterman. If they would have went with Adam Waterman, that would have been hilarious. But also, that would be like, I'm a John Doe. I'm nobody. Don't pay
Right.
attention to me. I'm not the Dead King. I'm Adam Waterman. I could
Yeah.
be anybody. Kind of like Donald Blake with Thor. So
Yeah.
that would maybe be one thing I could nitpick in the
Hmm.
comic that we read and say, well, using Orin, but that it's good to know where
I
that
mean,
came from
yeah,
too,
it was
that
done as
name.
a callback. That's why it was
Yeah.
there. It was basically an Easter egg for fans to be like, hey, do you remember 90s Aquaman? And also, this is the era where Aquaman first got the beard. So
Oh,
this story is the first story in Abnett's run where Aquaman has the beard again. So again, that's all of those things are kind of callbacks to like the Peter David comics. So if you were a longtime fan, it was there for you to enjoy. If you weren't, it doesn't really affect the story in any meaningful way. So,
sure.
but it is kind of cool to know that like Dan Abnett clearly has read a lot of Aquaman comics and like knows the history of the character, because he was kind of peppering those things in. So,
Hmm.
um, this version of Aquaman was also raised by dolphins before Volko found him, whom he could communicate with. And during the Peter David run, it was like, no, he actually talks to them and they talk back in words. So it
Oh,
wasn't
wow.
like the subtle telepathy thing. It was like they would like say things to him back and forth, and um he would there's like this awful panel of him swimming like completely naked with all these dolphins, and he's like asking uh you know one of the dolphins that raised him, he's like, your daughter is so beautiful, why won't you let me be with her? And she's like, you're not like us, don't you know? And I'm just like, did Peter David really need to write that into the story? Like, that was
I
it's
was gonna say, when you said raised by dolphins, that was my first thought, was like, dolphins are really frisky, and to have a
yeah.
serious story, I don't, you'd be kind of thinking that in the back of your mind, but then you describe that scene of him like naked with the dolphins, and I'm like, okay, that's it.
Yeah.
I'm
No,
I'm done. No thanks.
he totally addresses it, and I feel like they could have cut that out of the comics and it would have been
Yeah,
fine. But
we don't
for better or
pick
worse,
something else.
that's part of his 90s origin.
Yikes. Good thing that
So,
didn't make it to Super Friends.
oh man, yeah, I know.
Be
Well,
even
it
more of a joke
automatically would have been a
character.
very different show at that point.
Well, there's been some,
But
I think there's been some like Robot Chicken, or something, and actually on Lower Decks, Star Trek Lower Decks, there's like dolphin uh
mhm.
Starfleet
Oh yeah,
officers, and
cetacean ops.
yeah, and so they're like, hey, why don't you take your clothes off and jump in with us, and stuff like that. And so dolphins are very much like, that kind of
Yeah.
joke, where they tend to be, like that. And so I'm really glad that in the mainstream media, Aquaman's not associated with that, because that probably would have
Yeah.
really put the nail in
Yeah,
the
that would
coffin.
destroy his character.
Yeah.
So Peter David does actually, interestingly, have him meet Tom Curry, although that's not his father. And Tom
Weird.
Curry dubs him Arthur Curry after himself. So
But
his
why?
name was Oren from his parents. And Tom meets him and is like, oh, you're Arthur Curry, and like tries to raise him or whatever. But
Oh.
Tom disappears at one point, and then Aquaman, that's the easiest way to describe him, or Orin, eventually leaves, falling in love with, it's almost like an Inuit girl, like it's somewhere up near I think it's a like a tribal people that Peter David made up, but they're people that live near the water, like up in the Arctic or something. He falls in love with a girl named Kako, and unbeknownst to him, conceives a son named Koryak. So that's also becomes part of Aquaman's supporting cast for the 90s, is his son. It was also during this era that it was established that both Aquaman and Ocean Master shared the same father, making them half brothers. So before this point, even in the Silver Age, they were not related, or at least we didn't know that they were related. So this is Peter David is the one that introduced that element of like, no, they have the same parentage, at least at one point. Although the version we know is it's the same mother. So yeah.
So okay, let me see if I got this straight now. So
yeah,
Orm and Orin are born brothers, are half brothers, and Orin is like somehow not part of Atlantis and gets raised by dolphins and learns how to swim naked with the fish. And so in that tradition, he leaves the ocean and somehow is on land. And well, first he gets adopted by a land guy who gives him a new name and names him after himself. And then he goes on to fall in love with a tribal girl, and they have a child. So,
yes, that's correct.
Okay.
There's a lot happening in his origin. It's very complicated what was going on with him in the 90s. And the only way I can explain why this was done is that people were trying to do more traditional takes on him post-crisis, and the book just wasn't selling. And so Peter David just went back to square one with the character, completely rewrote his entire origin, and this is what we ended up with. The main elements that, there's a lot of stuff in there for, he is definitely a writer that does edgy things. I mean, that's something that he's known for. So this is a darker, more mature take on Aquaman. You know, once he starts doing sort of superheroing stuff, again, the idea was we've got to get away from the Super Friends thing. So one of the first villains that he fights is Piranha Man, who actually chews his hand off.
Oh.
And so Piranha Man actually I mean, he's like a big beefy dude with like scales and like a fish head, and I mean, he looks kind of like the Trench do in the movie, honestly.
Okay.
That's kind of how Piranha Man looks. So yeah, but he actually bites Aquaman's hand off. So then,
and then
because it's the 90s,
right? Or
yes,
thing,
because,
that's right.
Because it's the 90s and everything is extreme, he goes, well, I don't want you to replace it with a hand. Put a harpoon there.
Yeah,
so there's this giant like harpoon like blade on the end of his hand. And that was the version of Aquaman that we had for quite a while.
We had that in Justice League Unlimited, didn't we? With the harpoon.
Yeah.
That's right. I remember seeing that. That's funny.
Yeah. Jeez. So in that, they actually had him cut his own hand off in that Justice League episode in order to like free himself and save his baby. So they actually justified it a little bit better in that Justice League episode than they did in the comics. But, you know, it is what it is.
Wow.
Also... Piranha Man. He's not somebody I've seen come back a whole lot, except in the 90s, but he was a big deal once upon.
I'm sure he really chews the scenery when he's on the panel.
He's one of those two that I think every artist decided to draw him differently. So like he never looked the same, and there will always be some kind of like, I swam through some toxic waste and now I look like something like that.
I mean, he's an ugly character, right? So as long as you draw him ugly, I mean, you can't really go wrong, right? Big teeth. That's the important part, is big teeth. Bitey.
Pretty much. So also during the 90s, Dolphin was introduced, first as a love interest for Orin, but later she moved on to his sidekick, Garth, who's now going as Tempest. And I guess a quick note about Tempest, he had like different elemental magic in each hand during this era. That was another change, was making him kind of like a mage was something that Peter David did. So that carried over into all subsequent versions of the character. But Dolphin and Garth actually conceived a child named Serdian. and they were main characters during most of these years in the comics. Dolphin became really well established as like a supporting cast member in the Aquaman
Hmm.
title. So, like I said before, she was really sassy, and that's really different than what we read in Dan Abnett's story
Yeah.
today. But I also think that it's partially just of that time of it was a time where they were trying to do more female empowerment in movies and media and all kinds of things like that. And she was definitely a character that came out and like spoke her mind and was like, this is how it is, and all that kind of thing. So I think it was very like of the era as well. I don't know.
Hmm. But to take
Maybe
her,
Peter David pushed it a little too far in some cases, but that's kind of like what he does.
I
So
guess
I don't know.
Abnett thought so because you made her mute. Like, I don't want to hear from
Yeah,
her at
I
all. Like,
know, right?
yikes.
So moving out of this era into the 2000s, there are other writers that decided to kind of retool Aquaman a little bit, and they actually gave him an enchanted water hand that he could like manipulate the water on it instead of the harpoon, which allowed him
Hmm.
like various water-based abilities, although it was originally thought to have a cost if he used the hand for violence. So this tied him
What?
really tightly to like King Arthur and Arthurian legend, because the Lady of the Lake
Uh,
from like Arthurian legend gives him the water hand, like
okay.
actually, and enchants it. And so that's how he gets that ability. But
Hmm.
they started out being like, you can't use it for violence, there will be a cost. And they did like one 6-issue arc on that and then changed writers, and then everyone afterwards was like, he totally uses it for violence and there's no problem. So, and they like never explained it either.
Wow.
So it's very funny. I mean, I've got some comics back there where he's like shoving it down somebody's throat and like depriving them of air or something, like while he's
It's like
fighting them. And
waterboarding them
yeah,
with his hand.
it's yeah,
Wow.
basically, yeah, it's
Yikes.
crazy. So
Oh
so
my
it's pretty
gosh.
ridiculous.
I didn't know that Aquaman got so violent. Like,
Yeah,
that's
they
crazy.
really like the thing with Super Friends damaged the character a lot, I think. And so the comic books really did like a hard turn the other direction, where they were
Yeah.
just like, no, like he's angry, he's violent. And so a lot of times when people would see like the version of Aquaman in Zack Snyder's Justice League, for instance, and they're like, well, why is he broody and why is he angry and stuff? I'm just like, that's just the 90s. Like,
Hmm.
he likes the 90s. Death of Superman was in the 90s. Arthur was like that in the 90s. It all made sense to me because those movies feel like he was just pulling from one era of comics, basically. So
Okay.
to me, I'm just like, well, that's an era of Aquaman that existed. So it never really bothered me that much. And then we get into Aquaman's solo movie, and they definitely lightened him up a little bit, which I think was good,
Yeah,
for the
except for
character.
some of the
So,
corny jokes. Like there were a couple that just seemed like they were really just thrown in there. And there's one like
oh,
really, really bad one that I just like, oh man. Halfway through the movie
yeah.
and they're revealing the secrets and they need a little bit of water to activate this like runic
Hmm.
thing. And they're like, well, here, I'll get some, Mara takes some like water from his forehead or sweat or whatever, which, they're in the desert
Yeah.
and they're dehydrated and they're fish people, or not fish people, but they're water people. So that's probably not a good
Yeah.
idea. But then they have to go and ruin it by him saying, I could have just peed on it. Like, really?
Yeah.
Come on. You couldn't have come up with
That
something
and the
more
moment
clever?
where he sniffs his own armpit after she says he
Yeah.
stinks, and he kind of goes, ugh.
Underwater.
Both of
Like,
those, both of,
can you
yeah, both of those,
can
I
you
was
sniff
just like,
yourself
can you even
underwater?
smell that underwater? Yeah, those were pretty bad. So
Yeah.
but this basically brings us into, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that happens, but those are kind of the highlights. This brings us to the modern era, which is everything that's happened since the New 52. Now they've integrated a lot of legacy elements back into continuity, and a lot of things that fans missed have been brought back in for one reason or another. That was part of what the Rebirth Initiative did, and now I think Infinite Frontier is the publication era that we're in that kind of has a lot of legacy stuff brought back. But for all intents and purposes, the modern Aquaman does use the Silver Age origin. So he's got the dual heritage from Atlantis and the surface with Tom Curry and Atlanta. And but they did keep the 90s. He has a vendetta with his half brother Orm, so that
Mhm.
that element they brought in. So Jeff Johns basically, at when New 52 began, that was one of the titles that he started writing immediately, and he completely streamlined, like, let's keep everything that works, throw out everything that doesn't, and go back to a simpler origin for the character. And
Yeah.
I think ultimately that was a good idea, because what Peter David wrote was very 90s, and it just doesn't really work anymore, honestly.
No.
So
It sounds crazy hearing it now, and like if that's the
yeah.
version that we got, in the movie, I think it would be very hard to not, go back to Super Friends and be like, this is a weird character, especially like swimming with the
Right, right,
dolphins, like
right.
Jason Momoa. I'm sure the ladies would like that scene, but like, Jason Momoa buck naked swimming with dolphins and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Like that would have been a Aquaman we don't need to see. So I'm glad. Whoops, earthquake or waterquake there. I'm glad that we
No,
did not get
waterquake.
that version.
So the biggest thing that Johns added that had not been sort of pulled from a previous run, or adapted from previous material, was that Arthur let Black Manta's father die. So
Hmm.
there's a lot of miscommunication between those two characters in the comic. And long story short, the lighthouse is raided by Manta's father when Aquaman's not there, and Arthur Curry is having a heart attack. And so, being angry, Arthur, instead of rushing his father to the hospital, goes and chases down Manta's father and kills him, out of revenge. So that's basically what happens. And now these two characters are kind of bonded by the collective death of both of their fathers. So that's kind of like they both have hatred between them on both sides. The movie didn't
Hmm.
portray it quite as well. In fact, I think they were scared of having Aquaman murder him outright in the movie. I think they were a
Yeah.
little worried to do something like that. So they definitely dressed it up to make him more sympathetic, where it was like, well, he just let him die. He didn't actually do it. But in the comics, it's really more portrayed as like he just lost control for a minute, and he went and, while he was like choking the guy, then Manta's father has a heart attack and dies. And then Manta's like, you killed my father. And that begins their whole feud. And so there's a lot of bad blood between them in the comics now that wasn't necessarily there before. He also established that Black Manta's real name for the first time is David Hyde. He had never had a
Hmm.
civilian identity before, like, the 2011 era of comics. So kind of like the Joker, where like we don't know who he is. It's Black Manta was just Black Manta. So I guess the other really significant thing in kind of like the modern era of comics is that right before New 52, Young Justice was a really popular TV show,
Yeah.
and there was a new Aqualad that they introduced there, who was revealed
Hmm.
to be the son of Black Manta. So that character was like really popular, and kind of like Harley Quinn was in animation, and then they added her into the comics later. That's what happened with
Ah,
this
okay.
Aqualad. So he was really popular because of animation. They tried to add him into like Titans comics, but unfortunately it was like right before the era where DC was going to reboot, and so he really only had like one or two appearances prior to current continuity. So I think it was like 2009, 2010, somewhere in there, and then that era was like wiped out. Um, so fans of him were like, well, when do we get to see him? But they finally, during the Rebirth era in like 2016, they added him in as a member of the Teen Titans, and they gave him the name Jackson Hyde. So again,
Hmm.
they're very clearly going like he's the son of Black Manta.
Yeah.
And he also has the dual heritage thing that Aquaman has, because his mother is from Zebel, which that explains why he has like the water bending powers basically that he has.
Hmm.
Although he can also like channel electricity through it, is a thing
Yeah.
that he can do. So, and he makes like blades that he fights with. So Mira's more like she can hit a huge AoE. Like she's gonna do a ton of damage to like a giant area, where Jackson would be more of like the hand to hand person, with
Hmm.
that ability. So that's kind of like the difference between them. But yeah, he obviously has a lot of conflict because his father is Aquaman's greatest enemy. but he also ends up aligning himself with Aquaman and the heroes, and so there's a lot of, cool character stuff that they can do there. So,
Interesting.
and then finally, the last sort of chapter of Aquaman's title, which actually ended in, it was 2018 or 2019, was Kelly Sue DeConnick's run, which she revealed that Mira was pregnant and eventually gave birth to a little girl named Andy. And so that kind of brings us full circle and rectifies that like awful infant killing incident that's in Aquaman's past, because like now finally he has a kid again and he can be happy and he's with her, and that sort of ends the years of like strife between their characters. And she did eventually have them end up getting married in the last issue of her run too. So this whole struggle that you were reading about in the story today, like all the politics in Atlantis and all that stuff, kept them from getting married until like issue 75 or something like that. So, and we were what, in like the 20s and 30s. So yeah, I mean, it was a long time coming. So that's pretty much the Aquaman comic book history. Yeah, I don't know, thoughts, impressions.
So, I knew that Aquaman had some history, but I guess I really didn't know much about like what went on in the 90s. So that was really interesting to hear about, and some of the, crazy ways that they took him, and his origins as Adam Waterman are pretty funny. So it's been a wild ride.
I was gonna say the 90s are fun. The 90s are fun, but I don't need to go back to them.
No.
It's something that it's fun for me to go back and read those comics and just see how crazy the stories got. But I'm definitely happy with where DC has positioned the character now. And people get mad about creative decisions made all the time, but I think he's one of them that they finally settled into like a good status quo with him. So
yeah,
hopefully, I mean, he's only been showing up lately in like Justice League, and then also in like team up books and miniseries and stuff like that, but he hasn't had an ongoing for a while. So hopefully that's something that they'll do in the near future. I don't know.
Well, I guess we'll find out. But I really, I really enjoyed reading this comic. I'm glad that you picked it, and I am going to go and read some more Aquaman because of this, because I really I thought this like I didn't really have maybe expectations going in, so there wasn't anything that would be above or below. But even if I did have expectations, I think this would have exceeded it. Like the movie was really good and I enjoyed it, and there are some things about it that I would definitely like strike against it, but there wasn't really anything that I counted against this comic. Maybe I'm not being, maybe I'm missing some things that really were glaring, but I really enjoyed it. I thought it was cool. They had a neat world that they built, and the art was really great. And yeah, I just had no complaints. I couldn't give it a 5, but I guess I could have gave it a 4.9999 and really ruined your math, but oh well.
Yeah, I felt the same way. One thing I did want to tell you that is the weirdest change that they made is that Nereus is Mira's betrothed in the comics, not her father. So Mira was supposed to, before her wedding with Nereus, who's from Zebel, she was supposed to go assassinate Arthur, and then she falls in love with him instead. And that's what happens in the New 52 comics. This character didn't exist before that. Why they took that name and made it her dad in the movie, I don't know.
That's weird.
But it's really weird. And like every time I watch the movie, I think about it and I'm just like, why did they do this? Because it's like literally pick any name but that one. Because this is the guy she was supposed to marry in the comic books. So I just, I don't know. That was really weird.
Strange choice. All right. Well, this has been another Boneless Comics podcast after show. Thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you've had a fun swim with us in the deep end of the Aquaman history and lore and comic books. So thank you so much for treading water. And we will... I'm trying to think of all the water puns I need to get
I know. I'm just waiting. I'm waiting to see how many more you have.
All right, well, we're going to flush this episode. And no, we're not going to flush it. We're going to end.
Now the scales have fallen from your eyes and you understand about Aquaman.
There we go. Now you know. You know about his dark past and his harpoon hand and his apparently waterboarding
Yep.
hand,
Water hand.
and Piranha Man, and all those things. So, all right. Thanks. We'll talk to you later.
Thanks for listening. Watching.
Thanks.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.